The needle pierced my arm for the third time today, and I watched Nurse Bradley's satisfied smirk as the sedative coursed through my veins like liquid lead. Through the reinforced glass window of Ward 7, I could see the massive LED ticker crawling across the Goldman Sachs building opposite. Tesla down 15.3% at $847.23, just as I'd predicted yesterday during my episode. Just as I'd screamed about until Dr. Morrison had ordered them to increase my Haldol dosage to levels that made my thoughts swim through molasses. Still talking about your magic crystal ball, Chen? Dr. Morrison adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, expensive Mont Blanc pen hovering over his leather-bound clipboard like a vulture. His voice carried that particular condescension reserved for patients he'd already written off. Your family is very concerned about these recurring delusions. Your stepmother called again this morning, asking if we'd made any progress with your financial fantasies. Financial fantasies. That's what they called my desperate, increasingly frantic attempts to explain that GameStop would surge to exactly $347.51 next Tuesday at 2:17 p.m. That Dogecoin was about to crash from 23 cents to 8 cents within the next 72 hours. That Moderna's stock would triple by month's end when the FDA fast-tracked their new variant booster. Everything I'd lived through before in my previous life playing out with mechanical precision while I watched helplessly from behind reinforced glass and pharmaceutical fog. Please, I whispered, my tongue thick and unresponsive from the antipsychotics. The words felt like they were traveling through cotton. Just check the market tomorrow morning. Tesla will rebound to exactly $892.47 by noon. AMD will announce their new partnership with Microsoft, sending their stock up 23%. I'm not crazy, Dr. Morrison. I'm not making this up. Dr. Morrison made another careful note in his file, probably something about persistent grandiose delusions, or continued detachment from reality. His handwriting was precise, clinical, damning. Lily, you're a 22-year-old woman with no background whatsoever in finance or economics. You never even took a business class in high school. These elaborate fantasies about predicting the stock market with supernatural accuracy are textbook symptoms of grandiose delusional disorder. Your stepmother was absolutely right to bring you here before you could hurt yourself or others with these episodes. My stepmother, Victoria Ashworth Chen, the woman who'd orchestrated this entire nightmare with the precision of a chess grandmaster, moving pieces around a board I hadn't even known we were playing on until it was far too late. Let me tell you how I ended up here, drugged and strapped to a narrow bed in Willowbrook Mental Health Facility, watching my mathematically impossible predictions dismissed as the ravings of a delusional madwoman while the woman who destroyed my life walked free with my money in her perfectly manicured hands. I died at 28 years old on December 15th, 2023, at exactly 11:47 p.m. I remember everything with crystal clarity. The way the rain hammered against my Tesla Model S's windshield like bullets, the amber glow of the traffic lights reflecting off the wet asphalt, the massive Peterbilt semi-truck that ran the red light at 65 miles per hour and turned my luxury sedan into twisted metal and shattered dreams. I remember my last coherent thought as consciousness faded. Bitter, overwhelming regret that I'd never found the courage to stand up to my family, never fought back against the woman who'd spent years systematically stealing everything that should have been mine. But I woke up. Not in a hospital room with concerned doctors and life support machines, not in some abstract concept of heaven or hell, but in my childhood bedroom in my father's Georgian mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. The same pale pink walls I'd hated as a teenager, the same white provincial furniture that Victoria had chosen to make me feel like a little girl, the same Princeton University acceptance letter pinned to my corkboard, dated 6 years in the past from a timeline I'd already lived through once. I was 16 again, physically and legally, but with all the memories, experiences, and hard-won wisdom of my adult life burning in my mind like a fever dream. At first, lying there in my childhood bed as dawn light filtered through curtains I remembered hating, I thought it was some kind of miracle. A divine second chance. An opportunity to rewrite the mistakes and missed opportunities that had led to my miserable, unfulfilled first life. I had insider knowledge that no hedge fund manager or Wall Street titan could even dream of possessing. Perfect, detailed memories of every major market movement from 2017 to 2023. I could make my father proud for the first time in either of my lifetimes, build the kind of generational wealth that would force my family to finally see my worth, prove once and for all that I was more than just an inconvenient reminder of his first marriage. My father, Robert Chen, was a legend in financial circles. He'd built Chen Holdings from a small family investment firm into a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund empire, with offices in Manhattan, London, Hong Kong, and Singapore. He'd married my mother, Sarah, when I was 3 years old. She was a brilliant economist from MIT who'd challenged him intellectually in ways that his previous trophy wives never could. But Mom died in a car accident when I was 7, and within 18 months, Dad had married Victoria Ashworth. Victoria was 20 years his junior, a former Miss Connecticut runner-up who'd married well the first time and inherited a small manufacturing fortune from her late husband. She came as a package deal with Isabella, her daughter from her first marriage, who was just 2 years older than me and everything I would never be. Blonde where I was dark, outgoing where I was thoughtful, naturally charming where I was awkward and intellectual. In my first life, I'd watched helplessly as Isabella became the golden child, the daughter Dad had apparently always wanted. She got the Ivy League education at Harvard Business School that I dreamed of since childhood, the trust fund worth $50 million, the corner office at Dad's firm with a view of Central Park, and a starting salary that most people never see in a lifetime. Meanwhile, I was pushed aside, given scraps and consolation prizes, told repeatedly that I just wasn't business material, despite my finance degree from NYU and my natural aptitude for market analysis. But this time would be different. This time, I had knowledge they couldn't dismiss, insights they couldn't ignore, a track record they'd have to respect. I started carefully, methodically, the way I'd learned to approach everything in my first life. At 16, I convinced Dad to let me manage a small portfolio, just $50,000 from my college fund. Pocket change by his standards, but enough to prove what I could do. I told him about Netflix's upcoming subscriber surge, about Bitcoin when it was still trading under $1,000, and most people thought cryptocurrency was a scam, about the pharmaceutical companies that would dominate headlines during the pandemic that was still 3 years in the future. I was careful never to be too specific, never to claim perfect knowledge of future events. Instead, I framed my insights as research and trend analysis, staying just vague enough to avoid suspicion while being specific enough to generate massive returns. For 6 months, I was golden. My small portfolio grew to $200,000, then $500,000, then nearly $800,000 as each of my educated guesses paid off with mathematical precision. Dad looked at me with something approaching pride for the first time in either of my lifetimes, actually listening when I spoke during family dinners instead of tuning out or changing the subject to Isabella's latest achievements. "You know, sweetheart," he said one evening as we reviewed my latest quarterly returns in his home office, "you might actually have a real gift for this. Your instincts are remarkable for someone your age." Victoria's smile grew tighter and more brittle with each passing day as my success became impossible to ignore. Isabella, meanwhile, was struggling with her junior year of high school, her grades slipping as the pressure of being the perfect daughter began to show cracks in her facade. But I pushed too hard, too fast. The knowledge burning in my head was like a drug. I wanted to share everything I knew to prove beyond any doubt that I was the financial genius our family had been waiting for. When I started talking about the upcoming pandemic in early 2019, describing with suspicious accuracy the timeline of lockdowns, the specific companies that would profit from remote work technology, the exact progression of vaccine development and distribution, Victoria saw her opportunity. She'd been watching me carefully, documenting everything with the patience of a predator, recording my unusual predictions on her iPhone, photographing my detailed notes about future market movements, building a comprehensive case that I was experiencing severe psychotic episodes disguised as financial insight. "She believes she can see the future, Robert," I overheard her whispering to Dad one night through his study door, her voice perfectly modulated to convey just the right mixture of concern and fear. "She talks about this pandemic like it's already happening, describes global shutdowns and millions of deaths with the kind of detail it's not normal, honey. Yesterday, she showed me charts about death rates and vaccination timelines that went out to 2023. She had pharmaceutical companies mapped out that I've never even heard of, talking about their stock prices like she'd already watched them play out. Dad wanted to believe in me, I could tell, but Victoria was persuasive. And she had Isabella supporting her narrative with the loyalty of a daughter protecting her mother's interests. They painted me as increasingly unstable, dangerous to myself and potentially to others. My accurate predictions, instead of proving my competence, became evidence of my delusions. When the pandemic actually hit in March 2020, instead of vindication, I got suspicion and fear. How could a 17-year-old girl have possibly known about global supply chain disruptions and vaccine development timelines unless something was seriously wrong with her mental state? The final straw came when I tried to warn Dad about the GameStop surge in January 2021. I'd made over $3 million in my first life riding that wave, and I was desperate to replicate that success, to prove once and for all that my insights were real and valuable. But my frantic explanations about Reddit communities and short squeezes, about how retail investors would coordinate through social media to destroy institutional short sellers, sounded like elaborate conspiracy theories to ears that had already been poisoned against me. Lily, Dad said, his voice heavy with disappointment as he reviewed my increasingly erratic-sounding notes. I think you need to talk to someone. These theories about coordinated market manipulation through internet forums, sweetheart, this isn't healthy. You're 17 years old. You should be worried about prom and college applications, not spinning elaborate fantasies about financial warfare. Victoria struck while Dad was traveling for a conference in Singapore, a carefully timed attack that left me defenseless and isolated. She'd already laid the groundwork through months of careful manipulation, planting seeds of doubt about my mental state with Dr. Morrison, a psychiatrist she'd found who specialized in adolescent disorders and had a reputation for aggressive treatment approaches. The emergency conservatorship was filed on a Friday afternoon when most courts were winding down for the weekend, and thorough review was unlikely. Victoria claimed I was an immediate danger to myself and others, citing my delusional episodes about future market crashes and my obsessive focus on financial predictions that were clearly impossible for someone my age to legitimately know. Her psychiatric evaluation, purchased for $50,000 in consulting fees paid to Dr. Morrison's private practice, described severe grandiose delusions, early onset schizophrenia, and acute risk of self-harm due to my detachment from reality. The report painted a picture of a deeply disturbed teenager whose brief financial success had triggered a complete psychological breakdown. When Dad returned from Singapore on Monday morning, I was already committed to Willowbrook Mental Health Facility. Victoria had frozen all my accounts, seized control of my nearly $1 million portfolio, and convinced him that immediate hospitalization was the only way to save my life. She tried to withdraw $500,000 to invest in some internet stock scheme, Victoria told him through carefully manufactured tears. She was talking about GameStop like it was going to make her rich, Robert. She wanted to put everything into a failing video game company because she'd had visions about it. Dr. Morrison says these kinds of financial delusions are classic symptoms of a complete break with reality. That was 8 months ago. 8 months of watching my predictions come true with perfect accuracy from behind reinforced glass, while Dr. Morrison made careful notes about my persistent grandiose delusions and continued detachment from consensus reality. 8 months of Victoria and Isabella visiting twice a week with concerned faces, asking when I'd be ready to accept help and stop living in these elaborate fantasy worlds. 8 months of my GameStop prediction playing out exactly as I described it, watching the stock surge from $17 to over $400 in a matter of days while I was dismissed as delusional. 8 months of pharmaceutical companies I'd named specifically posting record profits from vaccine development, while my insights were treated as psychotic episodes. But today, something fundamental changed. Today, as the Tesla stock price crawled across that ticker at exactly the price I'd predicted during yesterday's breakdown, I made a decision that would reshape everything. I was done being the victim of Victoria's elaborate manipulations. I had knowledge she couldn't even imagine, resources she'd forgotten about, and most importantly, I had absolutely nothing left to lose. The turning point came during art therapy of all places. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, the 73-year-old volunteer who ran our weekly sessions, was sketching quietly in the corner while I worked on what Dr. Morrison would later describe as obsessive financial charts and market prediction diagrams that demonstrated my continued inability to engage with reality-based activities. She glanced at my detailed predictions about Amazon's upcoming stock split, my careful calculations about cryptocurrency market movements, my precise timeline for the Federal Reserve's interest rate decisions over the next 6 months. Instead of the concerned frown I'd grown accustomed to from staff members, her weathered face showed something I hadn't seen in 8 months: genuine interest. "My grandson works at a trading firm downtown," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the ambient noise of other patients working on their prescribed therapeutic activities. "Marcus works at Whitmore Capital. They're a mid-tier firm, but respectable. He's mentioned some of these same companies in our phone calls, talked about similar market predictions that his firm has been tracking." For the first time in months, someone was actually listening to me instead of just documenting my words as symptoms. "Mrs. Patterson," I said carefully, keeping my voice low and my expression neutral in case any staff members were watching. "What if I told you that next Wednesday, Amazon's stock would split 20 to 1, and that the announcement would send the price up exactly 14.3% in after-hours trading? What if I told you the announcement would come at 4:47 p.m. Eastern, exactly 17 minutes after market close?" She studied my meticulously detailed chart with sharp blue eyes that belied her frail appearance. I could see the wheels turning in her mind, processing the specificity of my prediction against the backdrop of what her grandson had told her about market analysis. "I'd say," she replied slowly, "that would be very profitable information for someone in a position to act on it." That night, lying in my narrow hospital bed while the night shift made their rounds, I started planning. Not escape. That would only validate Victoria's claims about my instability and give her grounds to have me transferred to a maximum security facility. Instead, I would systematically prove my sanity while building the financial empire that would not only destroy her power over me, but leave her completely defenseless against the vengeance I'd been planning for 8 months. I began with Mrs. Patterson. Over weeks of careful conversation during art therapy sessions, I learned that her late husband had been a successful attorney who'd left her with a substantial investment portfolio that she'd never felt comfortable managing herself. More importantly, her grandson Marcus was a junior analyst at Whitmore Capital, drowning in student loans from Columbia Business School and desperate to prove himself in the ultra-competitive world of institutional finance. I gave her a list: 15 specific stock picks with exact dates and price targets covering the next 3 months. All based on my perfect memory of market movements I'd already lived through once, events that were as certain to me as historical facts. I told her to have Marcus verify each prediction, to document the accuracy with timestamps and screenshots, and to build a comprehensive record that would prove my financial competence rather than my supposed delusions. "Tell him to start small," I instructed during one of our sessions, sketching absently while other patients worked on their assigned projects. "Maybe $5,000 or $10,000 per trade. The goal isn't to get rich immediately, it's to establish a pattern of accuracy that can't be dismissed as luck." The first prediction hit with surgical precision. Microsoft announced their acquisition of Activision Blizzard at exactly $95 per share, just as I'd specified, sending the stock soaring 37.2% in a single trading day. Marcus, following his grandmother's advice, had positioned himself perfectly for the announcement and made more money in one afternoon than he typically saw in 6 months of salary. The second prediction followed 3 days later. Pfizer announced their new arthritis drug had passed phase 3 trials, exactly as I detailed, driving their stock up 22% in pre-market trading. The third came the following week when the Federal Reserve announced an interest rate decision that I'd predicted down to the quarter point. By the fourth week, Marcus was calling his grandmother every evening. His voice barely controlled excitement as he described how each of my predictions had played out with impossible accuracy. Mrs. Patterson relayed his questions during our art therapy sessions. Where was I getting this information? Did I have inside contacts at these companies? Was I somehow accessing proprietary research reports? She told him about me gradually, carefully, building up to the truth over several conversations. She described the young woman in Ward 7 who could predict market movements with supernatural precision, whose detailed financial knowledge far exceeded anything she should have been capable of, whose delusional insights kept proving themselves correct with mathematical inevitability. That's when I made my first real ally in the outside world. Marcus Patterson was 26 years old, ambitious beyond his means, and drowning in $180,000 of student debt from Columbia Business School. More importantly, he was intelligent enough to recognize opportunity when it stared him in the face, and practical enough to set aside questions about how this opportunity existed in favor of capitalizing on it immediately. When his grandmother arranged a meeting during visiting hours, he came expecting to humor a delusional patient as a favor to the woman who'd raised him after his parents died. He left as my secret partner in what would become the most audacious financial operation in recent memory. "I don't care if you're psychic, time traveling, or just incredibly lucky," he whispered during our second meeting, surrounded by the concerned family members of other patients and speaking in the coded language we'd developed to avoid suspicion. "Your predictions are printing money faster than I can execute the trades. What do you need from me?" What I needed was access, hidden accounts, shell companies, and most critically, a way to execute increasingly large trades without Victoria's knowledge or interference. Marcus had connections throughout the financial district, Columbia Business School classmates who could open accounts under dummy corporations, colleagues at other firms who could execute trades through offshore platforms that wouldn't appear on domestic regulatory filings. Over the following months, I fed him information in carefully coded letters that looked like innocent correspondence from a recovering patient to a concerned family friend. Each letter contained market intelligence disguised as casual observations. "I've been thinking about how much I enjoyed watching movies on Netflix during my childhood. I bet their new password sharing policy will really help their subscriber numbers next quarter. The weather has been so cloudy lately. I hope Microsoft's new cloud computing expansion goes better than the forecast suggests." Every prediction played out exactly as I remembered from my previous life. Microsoft's Azure division exceeded earnings expectations by 23%, driving the stock to new all-time highs. Netflix's password-sharing crackdown resulted in 8.7 million new subscribers, exactly as I'd experienced it before. The Federal Reserve's interest rate decisions, the FDA's drug approvals, the quarterly earnings surprises, all of it unfolded with the precision of a Swiss watch while I watched from my hospital bed. Our hidden portfolio grew from Marcus's initial $50,000 investment to $500,000 within 2 months, then to $2.8 million by the end of the third month. Each trade was documented with professional precision, every prediction time-stamped and verified, building an unassailable record of my financial competence that would be impossible to dismiss as coincidence or delusion. More importantly, Marcus was using his newfound success to build influence within Whitmore Capital. His remarkable track record earned him promotion to senior analyst, then to portfolio manager, positioning him for the bigger moves I had planned. His colleagues began seeking his advice, his recommendations carried weight in investment committee meetings, and his reputation as a rising star in the firm grew with each successful quarter. But growing wealth was only half my strategy. I also needed to systematically dismantle Victoria's credibility while building an ironclad case that would expose the conservatorship as fraudulent and potentially criminal. This required patience, careful observation, and the kind of long-term strategic thinking that Victoria had underestimated in me. During her twice-weekly visits, I started acting more stable, more compliant with my treatment regimen. I stopped talking about future predictions and instead focused on working through my delusions and accepting the reality of my situation. Victoria seemed pleased by my apparent improvement, convinced that the combination of heavy medication and social isolation was finally breaking my spirit and forcing me to accept her version of reality. She had no idea that I was recording everything. Mrs. Patterson, it turned out, had been a legal secretary for 43 years before retiring, working at some of Connecticut's most prestigious law firms and developing an understanding of legal procedure that rivaled many practicing attorneys. More importantly, she had friends throughout the Connecticut court system, clerks, paralegals, retired judges, who remembered her fondness for helping people navigate legal challenges that seemed insurmountable. Through Mrs. Patterson's network, I began building a comprehensive case that would expose the conservatorship as fraudulent, the psychiatric evaluation as paid testimony, and Victoria's management of my assets as criminal embezzlement. The key was Victoria's own greed and overconfidence. She'd been systematically skimming money from my accounts for months, using my assets to fund Isabella's lifestyle while documenting these expenditures as legitimate medical expenses. Expensive dinners at Manhattan's finest restaurants were labeled as therapeutic consultations with specialists. Luxury shopping sprees at Bergdorf Goodman appeared on my medical expense reports as patient comfort and dignity maintenance. A week-long vacation to the Hamptons was recorded as a family therapy retreat, designed to help my loved ones cope with my condition. Marcus used his growing network of contacts throughout the financial industry to trace these transactions, following money trails that revealed a pattern of systematic theft that would be impossible to explain away. But I needed more than embezzlement charges to destroy Victoria completely. I needed to prove that the conservatorship itself had been obtained through fraud, that she'd knowingly committed a competent person to psychiatric care for financial gain. The opportunity came when Dr. Morrison made a crucial error during one of our routine sessions. He referenced specific notes from my initial psychiatric evaluation, describing in detail conversations we'd supposedly had during my first week at Willowbrook, conversations that had never actually taken place, symptoms I'd never displayed, and behaviors that had been completely fabricated to support a predetermined diagnosis. As I noted in our session on March 15th, he said, consulting his file, you described elaborate fantasies about being reborn after a car accident, claiming to have perfect memory of future events that would occur over a 6-year period. You specifically mentioned dying in December 2023 and waking up in your childhood bedroom with intact memories of your adult life. I stared at him, my blood turning to ice water in my veins. I had never told him about my rebirth. I had never mentioned the car accident, never described the specific circumstances of my death, never shared the details of waking up in my teenage body with adult memories intact. Those were secrets I'd kept locked away, too dangerous and too impossible to share with anyone, especially not a psychiatrist who was already convinced I was delusional. Victoria had paid him to write a false psychiatric evaluation, creating detailed records of conversations that had never happened and symptoms that existed only in her imagination. Mrs. Patterson's legal contacts helped me understand the full implications of this revelation. This wasn't just medical malpractice or professional misconduct. This was criminal fraud that could result in prison sentences for both Victoria and Dr. Morrison while invalidating everything they'd built their case upon. But I still needed concrete proof, and obtaining it would require the most dangerous part of my entire plan, appearing to have a complete psychological breakdown that would give me access to my original medical files and psychiatric evaluation. The performance had to be perfect, calibrated precisely to achieve my goals without destroying my credibility permanently. Too subtle, and Dr. Morrison wouldn't escalate my case or order the comprehensive review I needed. Too dramatic, and I might be transferred to a maximum security facility where I'd lose access to Mrs. Patterson and my growing network of allies. I chose my moment carefully, timing the performance with my quarterly review meeting that would determine my treatment plan and medication schedule for the next 3 months. During a routine session with Dr. Morrison, I gradually escalated from my recent pattern of quiet compliance to apparent panic and distress, claiming that I was receiving new visions of financial disasters that would destroy the global economy within weeks. The specific predictions I made were carefully chosen for maximum impact. A banking crisis that would hit regional lenders in mid-March, starting with Silicon Valley Bank and spreading through the sector like wildfire. A cryptocurrency market collapse that would wipe out over $500 billion in value within a single week. And most importantly, a massive fraud investigation that would target healthcare companies engaged in systematic insurance billing schemes. Dr. Morrison, of course, interpreted these predictions as severe escalation in my delusional thinking that required immediate intervention. He ordered comprehensive psychological testing, including a complete review of my original intake files to identify potential triggers for this apparent regression in my condition. "We need to understand what's causing this setback," he told the attending nurse while I sat restrained in my bed, pretending to be heavily sedated. "Review everything from her initial evaluation. I want to see if there were warning signs we missed, patterns in her delusions that might help us adjust her treatment protocol." That's when Marcus and Mrs. Patterson's legal network struck with surgical precision. Armed with a court order obtained through Marcus's growing influence in the financial community and Mrs. Patterson's connections in the legal system, they demanded immediate access to all my medical records as part of a family concern investigation into the quality of care I was receiving at Willowbrook. The request came from a prestigious law firm that specialized in medical malpractice, signed by a senior partner who'd built his reputation on exposing fraudulent psychiatric commitments. The timing was perfect. Dr. Morrison, focused on my apparent crisis and the comprehensive testing he'd ordered, didn't scrutinize the legal request as carefully as he would have under normal circumstances. The files contained everything we needed and more. Detailed financial records showing Victoria's payments to Dr. Morrison's private consulting practice, backdated psychiatric evaluations that described conversations and symptoms from before I'd ever met him, and most damning of all, recorded phone conversations between Victoria and Dr. Morrison, discussing strategies for maintaining my commitment despite my obvious competence and the accuracy of my financial predictions. The girl is making accurate market predictions that are impossible to explain, Dr. Morrison's voice said on one recording. His professional demeanor dropped in favor of frustrated honesty. Her success rate is literally impossible unless she actually understands exactly what she's talking about. How do we maintain the diagnosis when her delusions keep proving to be correct? Focus on the impossibility, Victoria's voice replied, cold and calculating. No 17-year-old girl should be able to predict market movements with that level of accuracy. The fact that she's right doesn't make her sane. It makes her more dangerous. Emphasize the grandiose nature of her claims, the supernatural elements. Make it about the impossibility of her knowledge rather than its accuracy. But revealing this evidence immediately would have been strategically disastrous. I needed to time the revelation perfectly, coordinating it with financial moves that would leave Victoria powerless to fight back, while demonstrating my competence so conclusively that no court in the country would uphold the conservatorship. The climax of my revenge began in March 2023, as my hidden portfolio approached $50 million in value, and the market positioned itself for exactly the sequence of events I remembered from my previous life. The banking crisis hit precisely as I'd predicted during my breakdown just 2 weeks earlier. Silicon Valley Bank collapsed on Friday, March 10th, exactly as I'd experienced it before, triggering a cascade of panic that spread through regional banking stocks like wildfire. Signature Bank followed over the weekend, then Credit Suisse in Europe, creating global market turmoil that wiped out hundreds of billions in value within days. My short positions, executed through Marcus's increasingly sophisticated network of shell companies and offshore accounts, netted us enormous profits as bank stocks collapsed in perfect accordance with my predictions. But more importantly, the accuracy of my delusional banking crisis prediction was now documented and undeniable, creating a paper trail that would be impossible for Dr. Morrison to dismiss as coincidence. She predicted the exact sequence, Marcus told his grandmother during a hurried phone call, his voice tight with amazement and growing concern about the implications of my knowledge. Silicon Valley Bank on Friday, Signature over the weekend, Credit Suisse early the following week. She gave me the dates, the approximate stock price movements, even the regulatory response timeline. How is that possible unless she actually knew what was going to happen? But the banking crisis was just the opening move. The real target was Ashworth Industries, Victoria's family business that she'd inherited from her first husband and used as her primary source of wealth and social status. In my previous life, I'd watched Ashworth Industries crumble during the 2023 credit crisis, destroyed by over-leveraged real estate investments and creative accounting practices that would be exposed during the regulatory scrutiny that followed the banking collapse. The company had been hemorrhaging money for years, propped up by fraudulent financial statements and questionable lending practices that would inevitably collapse when subjected to serious examination. This time, I was ready to accelerate that collapse. Through Marcus's network of shell companies and proxy investors, I'd been quietly accumulating massive short positions against Ashworth Industries for months, building a coordinated attack that would trigger the kind of cascade selling that destroys companies overnight. More importantly, I'd been feeding carefully researched information to financial journalists and regulatory officials, using Marcus's contacts to ensure that investigations into Ashworth's business practices would begin at precisely the moment when the company was most vulnerable. The coordinated attack began on Tuesday morning, March 21st, exactly as I'd planned it. Banking regulators, armed with anonymous tips that traced back through several intermediaries to my network of allies, launched simultaneous investigations into Ashworth Industries' commercial lending practices and financial reporting standards. The regulatory announcement hit the stock market at 9:47 a.m., 17 minutes before I'd predicted it would during one of my delusional episodes 6 weeks earlier. Ashworth's stock price immediately went into free fall as institutional investors, already spooked by the banking crisis, began dumping their positions to avoid association with a company under federal investigation. Meanwhile, my short positions created additional selling pressure that amplified the decline, creating a feedback loop that drove the stock price down 67% by market close. But this was only the beginning. The coup de grace came the following morning when Marcus, now a vice president at Whitmore Capital thanks to his incredible track record over the previous year, called an emergency meeting with my father. "Robert," he said, spreading documents across the polished conference table in Dad's corner office overlooking Central Park. "We need to talk about your daughter's conservatorship." Dad looked confused and slightly annoyed at being interrupted during his morning market analysis, but Marcus's reputation for accuracy had grown to the point where his requests for meetings were granted immediately. "I don't understand," Dad said slowly. "Lily is receiving excellent care at Willowbrook. Dr. Morrison assures me that she's making progress with her condition." Marcus opened the first folder revealing trading records that documented 18 months of perfect market predictions. "These are records of trades executed based on predictions made by your daughter while she was confined to a mental health facility. Every single prediction has been accurate to within decimal points. Her success rate is literally impossible unless she actually understood exactly what she was talking about." Dad studied the documents with growing amazement, his trained financial mind immediately grasping the implications of what he was seeing. Profits that exceeded anything his own fund had achieved, timing that suggested either impossible luck or genuine insight into market dynamics that few professionals could match. "This can't be right," he said finally. "Lily has no experience with institutional trading. She's never had access to the kind of research and analysis tools that would make these predictions possible." Marcus opened the second folder, revealing the recordings of Victoria's conversations with Dr. Morrison. "Your daughter isn't sick, Robert. She's the most successful financial predictor I've encountered in 15 years of professional trading, and your wife has been systematically stealing from her while maintaining a fraudulent conservatorship." The recorded conversations played out in the quiet office while Dad listened with growing horror and rage. Victoria's voice, cold and calculating as she discussed strategies for maintaining my commitment, despite the obvious evidence of my competence. Dr. Morrison's voice, frustrated but complicit, as he outlined methods for documenting symptoms that didn't exist and conversations that had never taken place. "She predicted the banking crisis 3 weeks before it happened," Marcus continued relentlessly. "She gave me exact dates for the Silicon Valley bank collapse, specific regulatory responses, even the international ramifications with Credit Suisse. Your daughter has been trying to tell everyone that she could predict market movements, and instead of listening, they've been drugging her and dismissing her as delusional." The final blow came when Marcus revealed the scope of my hidden portfolio. $57 million, all generated through trades based on my impossible predictions, all documented and verified through independent financial institutions, all built from an initial investment that represented less than 0.1% of the final value. Lily isn't mentally ill, Robert. She's a financial genius who's been systematically abused and defrauded by the people who were supposed to protect her. And if you don't act immediately, Victoria is going to destroy what's left of her life while stealing everything she's built. That afternoon, Dad arrived at Willowbrook Mental Health Facility with a team of lawyers, court orders, and a fury I'd never seen in either of my lifetimes. The conservatorship was dissolved within 2 hours. Dr. Morrison was arrested on fraud charges before I'd even been officially discharged. Victoria, meanwhile, was watching her family business collapse in real time as regulators froze Ashworth Industries' assets and federal investigators executed search warrants at her home and offices. But I wasn't finished with her, not even close. As I walked out of Willowbrook for the last time, my mind clear of psychiatric medications for the first time in 18 months, I called Victoria from the parking lot. "Hello, Victoria," I said, savoring the sound of my own voice without the pharmaceutical slur that had defined my speech for so long. "I thought you should know that Ashworth Industries' stock price just hit zero. The Securities and Exchange Commission is treating the accounting irregularities as criminal fraud, and I believe federal prosecutors are seeking extradition prevention orders for family members who might attempt to flee the country." The silence on the other end of the phone was more satisfying than I'd imagined during all those months of planning this moment. You see, I continued, watching Dad's limousine pull into the hospital parking lot, the thing about my delusions is that they keep coming true with mathematical precision. And I predicted that you'd be in handcuffs by Friday afternoon. I ended the call before she could respond, then turned off my phone and walked toward my father, toward my freedom, and toward the empire I was about to build from the ashes of Victoria's life. 6 months later, I sat in my corner office on the 42nd floor of the Chrysler Building, watching the markets close on another extraordinarily profitable day. Chen Capital Management had grown from my hospital predictions into one of the most successful hedge funds in New York, with over $2.8 billion in assets under management and a client list that included pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and ultra-high net worth individuals from around the world. Dad worked for me now, his legendary reputation and decades of experience serving my vision and my supernatural ability to predict market movements. He'd accepted his new role with grace and growing respect, finally understanding who had been the real financial genius in our family all along. Marcus had become my partner and chief operating officer, his loyalty earned through shared success and the knowledge that I'd lifted him from a struggling junior analyst to one of the youngest fund managers in the city's history. Victoria was serving 12 years in federal prison for fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and a dozen other charges related to her systematic theft and abuse. Dr. Morrison had lost his medical license and was facing his own criminal charges that would likely keep him in prison for the next decade. Isabella, stripped of her trust fund and facing potential charges as an accomplice in her mother's schemes, had fled to London and wouldn't be returning to the United States anytime soon. The epilogue to my revenge was sweeter than I'd ever imagined during those dark months in Ward 7. But the most satisfying moment came during visiting hours at the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, where Victoria was serving her sentence. She looked diminished in her orange jumpsuit, her perfectly styled hair replaced by a regulation ponytail, her manicured nails now short and unpolished, her face aged years in the space of months. "How?" she asked, her voice hollow and broken. "How did you know about the banking crisis? How did you predict Ashworth's collapse? How did you know exactly when the regulators would investigate?" I smiled, the same expression I'd practiced during those long months when she'd visited me in the asylum, pretending maternal concern while plotting my complete destruction. The same way I knew Tesla would rebound to exactly $892.47, I replied softly. The same way I knew GameStop would surge to $347.51 on that specific Tuesday. The same way I knew your precious Ashworth Industries was built on fraudulent accounting that would collapse the moment anyone looked closely at the books. I leaned forward, lowering my voice to a whisper that forced her to strain to hear me. "I told you I wasn't crazy, Victoria. I told you I could predict the future, that my insights were real and valuable. You should have listened to me instead of trying to destroy me." As I walked out of that federal prison, my heels clicking on the polished concrete floors, I reflected on the strange justice of it all. In my first life, I died forgotten and defeated, surrounded by wealth I'd never been allowed to access, dismissed by a family that had never recognized my worth or potential. This time, I'd used their own greed, manipulation, and cruelty against them, turning Victoria's elaborate schemes into the foundation of her own destruction. Every prediction they'd dismissed as delusion had become another nail in the coffin of their power over me. Every impossible insight had generated the wealth and influence that would define their futures. The girl they'd tried to bury in Ward 7 had risen as the woman who now controlled their destinies. And unlike their schemes built on lies, manipulation, and fraud, my empire was constructed on something they'd never possessed: the absolute certainty of perfect knowledge. I was no longer the victim of their story. I had become the author of my own destiny, and their destruction was merely the opening chapter of the legacy I intended to build. Chen Capital Management continued to grow larger with each passing quarter, my predictions becoming the stuff of Wall Street legend, my success rate generating returns that institutional investors fought wars to access. The financial media called me a visionary, a once-in-a-generation talent whose insights were reshaping modern investment theory. But in the quiet moments, when I sat alone in my office watching the city lights twinkle 42 floors below, I sometimes thought about that terrified girl in Ward 7, drugged and dismissed, trying desperately to convince anyone who would listen that she could see the future. She'd been right all along. She just needed to learn how to make everyone else see it too. The stock ticker crawled across my monitor, showing closing prices that I'd predicted months in advance. Tesla at $951.47, Microsoft up 3.2% after announcing the cloud computing expansion I'd foreseen, Amazon steady after the stock split that had made my early investors hundreds of millions. Victoria's Delusions had made me richer than her wildest nightmares could have imagined. And this was still only the beginning of what I planned to accomplish with my impossible gift.